Women regret choosing the bear. Millions of women, when polled globally, were asked if they would rather run into a man in the woods or a bear. Most responded that they would rather run into the bear. Now, hard times have arrived. Women are struggling financially, are looking for men to help them, and don't want to go hang out with Yogi and Boo Boo in the woods. Kevin Samuels was right when he warned women that winter was coming and it has now arrived. If you have been enjoying these Angry Guy videos, you can show support by buying me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or through a monthly pledge using the link in the description. And that support keeps this conversation going because what we are talking about here is not surface level noise. It is something deeper, something structural, something that has been building quietly for years and is only now becoming impossible to ignore. There is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And the pattern goes like this. First comes the messaging, then comes the normalization, then comes the expectation, and finally comes the consequence. And for a long time, we lived in the first three stages without really feeling the fourth because consequences take time to mature. They do not show up immediately. They grow in the background like roots under concrete. And by the time they break through the surface, the structure above is already compromised. And that is exactly where things stand now. Because for years, men were told they were not needed, that they were the problem, that their presence was something to be tolerated at best and feared at worst. And at first, there was pushback, there was confusion, there was an attempt to adapt and adjust and fit into a changing narrative. But over time, something shifted, something fundamental, because people do not stay where they are not wanted forever. And eventually, men began to do the simplest thing possible. They stopped engaging. They stopped participating. They stopped investing themselves into a system that openly told them they were disposable. And what started as a slow drift has now become a clear and deliberate withdrawal. What makes the situation different is not just that men are walking away, it is that they are finding peace when they do. And that changes everything. Because if someone leaves and suffers for it, they are likely to return. But if someone leaves and finds something better on the other side, something quieter, something more stable, something free from constant tension and expectation, then there is no incentive to go back. And that is the part that was not anticipated. Because the assumption was always that men needed the system more than the system needed them, that they would complain, but ultimately stay, that they would adapt endlessly no matter how they were treated. But that assumption is collapsing under its own weight now because the opposite is happening. Men are stepping away, and instead of falling apart, they are reorganizing their lives in ways that are simpler, more controlled, and far less stressful. You can see it in small details that add up to something much larger. Routines that revolve around personal comfort instead of external validation. Priorities that shift from chasing approval to maintaining peace. A focus on health, on rest, on financial stability without unnecessary risk, and a rejection of dynamics that feel like constant negotiation or conflict. And what emerges is a kind of quiet independence that does not need to announce itself. It just exists, and the longer it exists, the more it reinforces itself. Because peace has a way of becoming addictive once you experience it consistently. And once someone builds a life around that peace, they become extremely resistant to anything that threatens it. At the same time, on the other side of the shift, there is a growing sense of realization that is difficult to ignore. And it does not arrive all at once. It comes in stages, it comes in moments, it comes in late nights and quiet mornings and conversations that do not quite land the way they used to. It comes in the form of questions that were never asked before, questions about the future, about stability, about companionship, about what happens when time keeps moving forward and certain options are no longer as available as they once were. And these questions do not have easy answers because they are tied to decisions that have already been made and paths that have already been taken. And that is where the weight of regret begins to settle in. not as a dramatic event, but as a slow and steady awareness that something important may have been misunderstood or miscalculated. There is a kind of tension that exists now between expectation and reality, and it is not subtle because the expectation was that independence would lead to fulfillment, that removing traditional structures would create space for something better. But reality is more complicated than that because independence without connection can become isolation, and freedom without stability can become uncertainty. And when those two things combine, they create a kind of quiet discomfort that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. And that discomfort grows over time because it is not being addressed at its root. It is being managed at the surface. It is being masked with distractions and temporary solutions that do not resolve the underlying issue. What makes the situation even more complex is that the conversation around it is often fragmented and reactive rather than honest and reflective, because admitting that something did not work as intended requires a level of humility that is not easy to access, especially after years of defending a particular narrative. And so instead of a clear and direct discussion, there is often confusion, frustration, and a search for explanations that do not fully address the core problem. And in the middle of all of that, the reality continues to unfold, regardless of how it is framed or interpreted. The phrase men walking away is not just a slogan or a trend, it is a description of a behavioral shift that has real consequences. Because when a significant number of people disengage from a system, that system changes whether it wants to or not. And the effects of that change ripple outward in ways that are not always immediately visible, but over time, they become impossible to ignore. And one of those effects is the restructuring of expectations around relationships, around partnership, around what people are willing to invest and what they expect in return. And when those expectations no longer align between two groups, the result is not compromise, it is separation. There is also a practical side to this that often gets overlooked because beyond the emotional and social dynamics, there are tangible realities that come into play. Things like economic stability, long term planning, support systems, and the simple logistics of navigating life as time moves forward. And these are not abstract concepts, they are real factors that influence quality of life in very direct ways. And when those factors are not aligned or accounted for, the impact is felt over time in ways that are difficult to reverse. What is happening now is not sudden. It is the result of years of incremental changes that have finally reached a tipping point. And once a system reaches that point, it does not easily return to its previous state because the people within it have already adapted to the new conditions. And adaptation creates new norms, new expectations, and new boundaries, and those do not disappear simply because there is a desire for things to be different. They remain in place because they have been reinforced through experience. There is a certain irony in all of this because the same independence that was promoted as a solution has now become a barrier to connection. And the same rejection of traditional roles has created a vacuum that has not been filled with something equally stable. And in that vacuum, there is uncertainty, and uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation makes it difficult to build anything lasting, and that cycle continues unless something fundamentally changes. The reality is that people are not as interchangeable as they were made out to be. And the idea that one group could simply replace or operate independently of the other without consequence has proven to be flawed because human dynamics are more complex than that. They rely on balance, on cooperation, on mutual investment. And when that balance is disrupted, the effects are not isolated. They spread across every aspect of life, from personal relationships to broader societal structures. At this point, what we are seeing is not just a shift in behavior, It is a shift in mindset, and mindset is much harder to change than behavior because it is rooted in experience. And once someone has experienced a certain level of peace, a certain level of control over their own life, they are very reluctant to give that up, especially if doing so would mean returning to a situation that previously caused stress or conflict. And that reluctance is not irrational, it is a logical response to past experience. On the other side, there is a growing recognition that certain expectations may need to be reevaluated. But that recognition is often accompanied by frustration because it feels like a reversal. It feels like a step back rather than a step forward. And that makes it difficult to approach the situation with clarity because emotions are involved, pride is involved, and those factors can cloud judgment and make it harder to see the situation for what it is. The truth is that this is not about blame, it is about consequence. And consequence does not operate on feelings, it operates on actions and outcomes. And when a series of actions leads to a particular outcome, that outcome exists regardless of how it is interpreted. And the only way to change it is to address the actions that led to it, not to argue with the result. There's also a timing element to all of this that cannot be ignored because time is not static. It moves forward whether people are ready or not, and certain opportunities are tied to specific periods in life. And when those periods pass, the opportunities associated with them change or disappear. And that is not a judgment, it is a reality. And understanding that reality is crucial to making informed decisions. What makes the current situation particularly challenging is that many of these realizations are happening later rather than sooner. And when realizations come late, the options available to respond to them are often more limited. And that creates a sense of urgency that can lead to decisions that are reactive rather than strategic. And reactive decisions rarely produce stable outcomes. Meanwhile, the group that has stepped away is not operating under that same urgency because they have already restructured their lives in a way that does not rely on the same variables. And that difference in urgency creates an imbalance in negotiation because one side is seeking resolution while the other side is maintaining stability. And those two positions do not naturally align. The result is a kind of stalemate where both sides are operating from completely different perspectives. And without a shared framework for understanding the situation, meaningful progress becomes difficult because each side is interpreting the same reality through a different lens. And those lenses are shaped by different experiences and priorities. There is no simple solution to this, and anyone who claims there is either oversimplifying or ignoring key aspects of the situation because real change requires a willingness to reassess assumptions, to acknowledge missteps, and to make adjustments that are not always comfortable. And that process takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a level of honesty that is not always easy to access. What is clear is that the current trajectory is not sustainable in its current form because imbalance eventually leads to instability. And instability forces change, whether it is planned or not. And the nature of that change will depend on how the situation is addressed moving forward, whether through deliberate action or through the natural consequences of continued inaction. At the core of all of this is a simple but powerful idea, and that is that actions have outcomes, and outcomes shape reality, and reality does not adjust itself to match expectations. Expectations have to adjust to match reality. And the sooner that alignment happens, the more effective any response will be. Right now, what we are seeing is the early stages of that alignment process. And it is not smooth, it is not comfortable, and it is not quick, but it is necessary because without it, the gap between expectation and reality will continue to widen. And that gap is where most of the current tension exists. The question moving forward is not whether the situation will resolve itself, it is how it will resolve and what the outcome will look like. And that will depend on the choices that are made from this point on. Choices that need to be grounded in reality rather than assumption, in clarity rather than confusion, and in a willingness to adapt rather than, a desire to return to something that no longer exists. Because at the end of the day, the silence is not just an absence, it is a signal, it is a reflection of a shift that has already taken place. And ignoring that signal does not make it disappear, it only delays the response. And delay in a situation like this only narrows the range of possible outcomes. There is a moment that keeps showing up now, and it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it does not announce itself with alarms or headlines. It just appears in quiet spaces where there is no distraction left to hide behind. And in that moment, a person looks around and realizes that the life they imagined would naturally take shape has not formed the way they expected. And the difference between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore because it is no longer theoretical. It is present, it is tangible, and it is sitting right there in the room with them. And the longer that moment lingers, the more questions begin to surface. Questions that were once pushed aside or dismissed as unnecessary. Questions about what actually matters, what actually lasts, and what choices led to the current situation. And those questions do not come with easy answers because they are tied to years of decisions, to influences that were accepted without challenge, and to assumptions that felt safe at the time but are now being tested by reality in a way that cannot be avoided. What makes this moment so difficult is that it does not offer a clean narrative. It does not allow for a simple explanation that places responsibility entirely on one side or the other. It requires a level of self examination that is uncomfortable because it challenges long held beliefs. And when beliefs are challenged, people tend to react rather than reflect. They look for something external to point to, something that can explain the situation without requiring them to reassess their own role in it. And that is where the conversation often gets stuck. Because without honest reflection, there is no clear path forward. There is only repetition of the same patterns that led to the current outcome. And repeating those patterns will not produce a different result, no matter how they are framed or justified. At the same time, there is a growing contrast that is becoming more visible. And that contrast is between those who have chosen to step away and those who are still trying to navigate within the existing framework. And the difference in their experiences is creating a kind of divide that is not just about behavior, it is about perception. Because when someone steps outside of a system, they begin to see it differently. They begin to notice things that were not as clear when they were fully engaged in it. And that shift in perspective can be difficult to communicate to those who are still inside the system because it challenges the assumptions that the system is built on. And when assumptions are challenged, there is often resistance, not because the challenge is invalid, but because it disrupts a sense of stability that people rely on. There is also a sense of time moving at different speeds, depending on where someone stands in this situation. Because for those who have stepped away, time feels more controlled, more predictable, more aligned with personal priorities. While for those who are trying to reconcile expectation with reality, time can feel accelerated. It can feel like opportunities are narrowing, like decisions need to be made more quickly. And that difference in how time is experienced adds another layer of complexity because it influences how each side approaches the situation, one from a place of stability and the other from a place of urgency. And those two approaches do not easily align because they are driven by different pressures and different priorities. There is a pattern that emerges when urgency meets stability. And that pattern often leads to frustration because the side experiencing urgency is looking for movement, for change, for some kind of response that addresses their concerns, while the side experiencing stability has little incentive to disrupt what is already working for them. And when those two positions interact, the result is often a lack of resolution because the motivations behind each position are fundamentally different. And without a shared motivation, it is difficult to find common ground that leads to meaningful change. What complicates this further is the role of expectations that were shaped over time through messaging that emphasized certain outcomes while downplaying others. And when those expectations are not met, there is a tendency to question the outcome rather than the expectation itself. And that can lead to a cycle where the same expectations are maintained, even when they are not aligned with reality. And maintaining misaligned expectations only prolongs the gap between what is desired and what is possible. And that gap is where most of the tension in this situation exists. There is also the factor of social reinforcement because for a long time, certain ideas were not just accepted, they were encouraged, they were validated, they were presented as the correct way to think and act. And when ideas are reinforced consistently, they become difficult to question because doing so can feel like going against a broader consensus, and people are naturally hesitant to do that, especially when the alternative is uncertain. And so, even when reality begins to challenge those ideas, there can be a delay in adjusting to that challenge because the reinforcement is still present, even if it is no longer accurate. The shift that is happening now is forcing a reevaluation of those reinforced ideas. And that reevaluation is not happening all at once. It is happening gradually in conversations and observations and experiences that do not match the expected outcome. And as those experiences accumulate, they begin to outweigh the reinforcement. And that is when a more honest assessment becomes possible. But that process takes time. And during that time, there is often confusion because the old framework no longer fully explains reality, but the new framework has not yet been clearly defined. There is a tendency in situations like this to look for a clear turning point, a moment where everything changed. But in reality, this is the result of many small changes that built up over time, changes in behavior, changes in attitude, changes in expectation. And each of those changes contributed to the current situation in a way that may not have been obvious at the time, but is now becoming clear when viewed collectively. And understanding that cumulative effect is important because it highlights that this is not something that can be addressed with a single adjustment. It requires a broader reassessment of the factors that led to it. At the same time, there is a growing awareness that certain dynamics that were once taken for granted are no longer guaranteed, and that awareness is reshaping how people think about relationships, about commitment, about long term planning, and that reshaping is not happening in a vacuum. It is influenced by the experiences people are having in the present, experiences that either reinforce or challenge their expectations. And as those experiences continue to unfold, they will play a significant role in determining how this situation evolves. There's also a practical aspect that cannot be ignored, and that is the reality of how people navigate life over time. Because beyond the emotional and social components, there are logistical considerations that become more significant as time progresses, things like financial planning, support systems, health, and the ability to manage responsibilities independently. And these considerations are not abstract, they are real factors that influence quality of life. And when they are not aligned with expectations, it creates additional pressure that needs to be addressed. What is becoming clear is that independence, while valuable, is not a complete solution on its own. It addresses certain needs, but it does not address all of them. And when it is treated as a complete solution, it can lead to an imbalance where some aspects of life are well managed while others are neglected. And that imbalance becomes more noticeable over time as the neglected aspects begin to have a greater impact on overall well being. There is also a shift in how value is perceived in this context, because for a long time, value was often associated with independence and self sufficiency, but there is a growing recognition that value also exists in connection, in cooperation, in shared responsibility. And when those elements are absent, it changes the overall dynamic in ways that are not always immediately apparent, but become more significant over time. The challenge now is that reintroducing those elements requires a willingness to adjust expectations and to engage with the situation in a way that acknowledges the current reality rather than the desired one. And that is not an easy process because it involves letting go of certain assumptions and being open to a different approach. And that can be difficult when there is a strong attachment to the previous framework. At the same time, the group that has stepped away is not operating under the same set of expectations. They have already adjusted their approach based on their experiences, and that adjustment has created a level of consistency that reinforces their decision to remain in that position. And as long as that consistency remains, there is little incentive for them to change course because, from their perspective, the current approach is working. There's also the factor of trust, which plays a significant role in any kind of partnership or cooperation. And when trust is compromised, it creates a barrier that is not easily removed because trust is built over time but can be lost quickly. And once it is lost, it requires consistent effort to rebuild, effort that needs to be matched on both sides in order to be effective. And without that mutual effort, the barrier remains in place. What we are seeing now is a situation where trust has been affected by a combination of messaging, experience, and perception. And addressing that will require more than just a change in language. It will require a change in behavior that is consistent and sustained over time. And that kind of change is not immediate, it is gradual, and it requires a level of commitment that goes beyond surface level adjustments. There is also a broader societal context to consider because these dynamics do not exist in isolation. They are influenced by cultural narratives, by economic conditions, by technological changes, and by shifts in how people interact and communicate. And all of these factors contribute to the overall environment in which these dynamics are playing out. And understanding that environment is important for making sense of the situation as a whole. One of the more significant factors in this environment is the way communication has evolved, because with increased connectivity comes increased exposure to different perspectives. And while that can be beneficial in some ways, it can also create confusion when there is a lack of clear and consistent messaging. And that confusion can make it more difficult to form a stable understanding of what is actually happening and what needs to be addressed. There is also the influence of comparison, because when people are constantly exposed to curated representations of others' lives, it can create unrealistic expectations about what is normal or achievable. And when those expectations are not met, it can lead to dissatisfaction that is not necessarily based on reality, but on a distorted perception of it. And that dissatisfaction can influence decisions in ways that are not always beneficial in the long term. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that not all narratives are equally reliable, and that some of the ideas that were widely accepted may need to be reevaluated in light of current experiences. And that reevaluation is an important step in aligning expectations with reality, because without it, there is a risk of continuing to operate based on assumptions that are no longer valid. There is also a need for a more balanced perspective, one that acknowledges both the value of independence and the value of connection, one that recognizes that neither extreme provides a complete solution, and that a sustainable approach likely exists somewhere in between. But finding that balance requires a willingness to move away from rigid positions and to engage with the situation in a more nuanced way. What makes this difficult is that nuance is often less appealing than certainty, because certainty provides a sense of stability, even if it is not entirely accurate, while nuance requires ongoing evaluation and adjustment. And that can feel less secure. But in situations like this, where conditions are changing, nuance is necessary for adapting effectively. There's also a need to separate identity from ideology, because when ideas become closely tied to identity, it becomes more difficult to question them. And that can prevent necessary adjustments from being made. And in this situation, separating the two allows for a more objective assessment of what is working and what is not. And that objectivity is crucial for making informed decisions moving forward. At the same time, there is an opportunity in this situation, and that opportunity lies in the ability to learn from what has happened and to apply those lessons in a way that leads to more stable and balanced outcomes. But taking advantage of that opportunity requires a willingness to engage with the reality of the situation honestly and without defensiveness. And that is not always easy, but it is necessary for progress. What is clear is that the current trajectory is not fixed, it can change. But that change will not happen automatically. It will require deliberate action. It will require adjustments in behavior and expectation. And it will require a level of cooperation that acknowledges the value of both independence and connection. And without that cooperation, the divide will likely continue to grow. There is also a need to recognize that time plays a role in shaping outcomes and that delaying necessary adjustments can limit the options available later. And that is why addressing these issues sooner rather than later is important, because it provides a wider range of possibilities for finding a solution that is both realistic and sustainable. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a process of realignment, a process where expectations are being adjusted to match reality. And that process is not smooth. It involves discomfort, it involves uncertainty, but it is a necessary step in moving toward a more stable situation. And the outcome of that process will depend on how it is approached, whether with resistance or with a willingness to adapt. The silence that was mentioned earlier is still present, but it is no longer just an absence. It is also a reflection of change, a sign that something has shifted in a fundamental way. And understanding that shift is key to understanding what comes next, because without that understanding, any response will be based on an incomplete picture of the situation. And an incomplete picture leads to incomplete solutions. And in a situation like this, incomplete solutions are not enough. There is another layer to this that does not get talked about enough, and it sits beneath all the surface level arguments and reactions. Because what is really unfolding is not just a shift in behavior, but a shift in incentives, and incentives are what quietly shape everything over time. They determine what people move toward and what they move away from. They influence decisions without needing to be announced, and when incentives change, behavior follows, whether people admit it or not. And for a long time, the incentives were structured in a way that encouraged participation, that encouraged investment, that made the idea of building something together feel worthwhile and stable. But over time, those incentives started to erode. They became less clear, less reliable, and in some cases, they flipped entirely, turning what was once seen as a benefit into something that felt like a risk. And when that happens, people adjust, not out of emotion, but out of logic, because no one willingly walks into a situation that consistently produces stress or uncertainty when there is an alternative that offers peace and control. What makes this shift in incentives so important is that it does not require coordination to take effect. It spreads quietly, one decision at a time, one person opting out here, another adjusting their priorities there. And before long, it becomes a pattern that is difficult to reverse because it is not being driven by a central force. It is being driven by individual choices that all point in the same direction. And that direction is away from complexity and toward simplicity, away from uncertainty and toward predictability. And once enough people move in that direction, it creates a new baseline, a new normal that others begin to observe and consider for themselves. And that is how a trend becomes a shift, not through a single moment, but through consistent repetition. There is also a psychological element at play that cannot be ignored. Because when someone feels that their efforts are not valued, or that their presence is more of a liability than an asset, it creates a kind of internal resistance that builds over time. And that resistance eventually leads to disengagement, not as a dramatic statement, but as a gradual withdrawal. And once that withdrawal reaches a certain point, it becomes the default state. And reversing that state requires more than just a change in messaging. It requires a change in experience, because people respond to what they experience more than what they are told. And if the experience does not align with the message loses its influence. At the same time, there is a growing awareness that certain outcomes are not guaranteed, and that awareness is forcing a reassessment of priorities, because when something is no longer assumed to be inevitable, it becomes something that requires intentional action. And that shift from assumption to intention changes how people approach their decisions. It makes them more deliberate, more cautious, and in some cases more selective about where they invest their time and energy. And that selectivity can lead to fewer opportunities for connection if the criteria for engagement becomes too narrow or too rigid. There is also the matter of expectations that were built on a timeline that does not align with reality. Because for a long time, there was a sense that certain things could be delayed without consequence, that there was always more time, always another opportunity, always a chance to revisit decisions later. But time does not operate on that kind of flexibility. It moves forward at a constant pace, and certain opportunities are tied to specific windows. And when those windows pass, the conditions change. And adjusting to those changes requires a different approach, one that acknowledges the current reality rather than relying on past assumptions. What is becoming more evident now is that the idea of endless optionality was never as stable as it appeared, because options are not just about availability, they are also about timing, compatibility, and alignment of priorities. And when those factors do not align, the presence of options does not guarantee a desirable outcome. And that is where many people are finding themselves now, in a situation where the theoretical availability of options does not translate into practical opportunities that meet their expectations. There is also a shift in how effort is perceived, because effort that does not produce a clear or consistent return tends to be reduced over time. And that reduction is not always conscious. It is often a response to patterns that have been observed, patterns where effort leads to diminishing returns or increased complexity without a corresponding benefit. And when those patterns become consistent, the logical response is to redirect effort toward areas where the return is more predictable. And that redirection contributes to the overall shift we are seeing. At the same time, there is a growing contrast between what is said and what is done, because messaging can promote one set of values while behavior reflects another. And when there is a disconnect between the two, it creates confusion and reduces trust, because people tend to rely more on observed behavior than stated intentions. And when behavior does not align with the message loses credibility. And that loss of credibility makes it more difficult to influence behavior moving forward. There's also the factor of risk assessment, because every decision involves a calculation of potential outcomes. And when the perceived risks outweigh the potential benefits, the likelihood of engagement decreases. And over time, as more people arrive at similar conclusions, it creates a broader pattern of avoidance, not out of fear, but out of rational evaluation. And that pattern reinforces itself as more examples emerge that support the initial assessment. What complicates this further is that perceptions of risk are not static. They evolve based on experience, on observation, and on information that is shared within a community. And when negative outcomes are highlighted more frequently than positive ones, it can amplify the perception of risk, even if the actual probability has not changed significantly. And that amplification can influence decisions in a way that leads to more conservative behavior, more hesitation, and ultimately less engagement. And there's also a structural component to consider, because the systems that support long term stability rely on consistent participation. And when participation decreases, those systems become less stable. And that instability can create a feedback loop where the reduced stability further discourages participation. And breaking that loop requires a deliberate effort to restore confidence in the system, not through promises, but through demonstrated reliability over time. At the same time, there's a shift in what people prioritize, because when stability becomes uncertain, individuals tend to focus more on what they can control directly. Things like personal well being, financial security, and environments that they can manage without external dependency. And that focus on control can lead to a reduction in activities that require shared responsibility or mutual dependence, because those introduce variables that are outside of individual control. There's also the influence of long term versus short term thinking, because decisions that prioritize immediate gratification or convenience can sometimes conflict with long term stability. And when those decisions are made consistently over time, they shape the overall trajectory in a way that may not align with long term goals. And recognizing that misalignment is an important step in adjusting course, but it requires a willingness to accept that some past decisions may not have produced the intended outcome. What is happening now is that many of these factors are converging at the same time, creating a situation where multiple pressures are being felt simultaneously. And when that happens, it can lead to a sense of overwhelm because there is no single issue to address. There are multiple interconnected elements that need to be considered, and addressing them effectively requires a comprehensive approach rather than a narrow focus on one aspect of the situation. There's also a need to consider the role of adaptation, because human behavior is highly adaptable. And when conditions change, people adjust, sometimes quickly and sometimes gradually. But the direction of that adjustment is influenced by the perceived benefits and risks of different options. And when one option consistently provides a better balance of benefit to risk, it becomes the preferred choice. And that preference becomes more entrenched over time as it is reinforced through experience. At the same time, is the recognition that not all adaptations are equally beneficial in the long term, and that some adjustments that provide short term relief may create long term challenges. And balancing those considerations requires a level of foresight that is not always easy to maintain, especially when immediate concerns are pressing. But without that balance, it is difficult to create a sustainable path forward. There is also a cultural dimension to this, because the values that are promoted within a society influence how individuals make decisions. And when those values shift, they change the framework within which decisions are made, and that can lead to changes in behavior that are not immediately obvious, but become more apparent over time as patterns emerge. What is becoming clear is that the current system of values and incentives is producing outcomes that are not aligned with long term stability. And recognizing that misalignment is the first step in addressing it. But recognition alone is not enough. It needs to be followed by adjustments that bring incentives, behavior, and desired outcomes into alignment. And that process requires coordination, consistency, and time. There is also the question of how change is initiated, because change can come from within a system or from external pressure. And in this case, much of the change is coming from individual decisions rather than centralized direction. And that makes it more complex to address, because there is no single point of control. There are many independent actors, each making their own choices based on their own experiences and assessments. At the same time, there is an opportunity to influence those choices by altering the conditions that shape them, by creating environments where the incentives align more closely with desired outcomes, where the risks are managed more effectively, and where the benefits of participation are clear and consistent. And doing so requires a focus on practical solutions rather than abstract ideals. There is also a need to rebuild confidence, because confidence is what allows people to engage without excessive hesitation. And rebuilding it requires demonstrating that the conditions have changed in a meaningful way, not just in theory, but in practice. And that demonstration needs to be consistent over time in order to be effective. What we are seeing now is a transitional phase, a period where old assumptions are being challenged and new ones are not yet fully established. And during this phase, there is often instability because the framework that previously guided behavior is no longer fully reliable, and the new framework is still being developed. And navigating this phase requires patience, clarity, and a willingness to adapt based on evolving information. There is also a need to manage expectations realistically because expectations that are not grounded in current conditions can lead to decisions that do not produce the desired results. And aligning expectations with reality is essential for making choices that are effective and sustainable. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all outcomes can be controlled and that some factors will remain uncertain regardless of how well they are managed, and accepting that uncertainty while still making informed decisions is part of navigating a complex situation like this. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a recalibration, a process where behavior, incentives, and expectations are being adjusted to align more closely with reality. And that process is not immediate. It takes time, it involves trial and error, and it requires a level of engagement that is focused on solutions rather than on maintaining positions that are no longer effective. The silence that was once described as an absence is now also a reflection of this recalibration, a sign that people are stepping back, reassessing, and making decisions based on their own evaluations rather than external expectations. And understanding that shift is key to understanding where things are headed because it highlights that the direction of change is being driven by individual choices that are collectively shaping the outcome. And those choices will continue to evolve as conditions change and as people adjust their approach based on what they experience. There is something else unfolding quietly beneath all of this, and it is not just about behavior or incentives or timing. It is about perception, reshaping reality in a way that becomes self reinforcing. Because once enough people begin to believe that a certain outcome is unlikely or undesirable, they start acting in ways that make that outcome even less likely to occur. And that creates a loop that feeds itself without needing any central coordination. And this loop is powerful because it does not rely on persuasion. It relies on experience, it relies on observation. And once people begin to see consistent patterns that confirm their assumptions, those assumptions harden into beliefs, and beliefs guide decisions far more strongly than abstract ideas ever could. What makes this loop so difficult to interrupt is that it is built on accumulated experiences rather than isolated events. And accumulated experiences carry weight. They create a kind of internal record that people refer to when making decisions. And when that record consistently points in one direction, it becomes very difficult to convince someone to move in another, not because they are unwilling to change, but because their past experiences do not support the idea that a different outcome is likely. And that is where the gap between messaging and lived reality becomes most apparent. Because no matter how compelling a message may sound, it cannot override a pattern of experiences that contradict it. At the same time, there is a shift happening in how people define success. And this shift is subtle but significant because it changes the criteria by which decisions are evaluated. Because for a long time, success was often tied to external milestones, to markers that were widely accepted as indicators of a stable and fulfilling life. But as those markers become less reliable or less attainable for various reasons, people begin to redefine what success means to them. And that redefinition often prioritizes factors that are more within individual control, such as peace of mind, personal autonomy, and the ability to avoid unnecessary stress. And while those factors are valuable, they also influence how people approach situations that require compromise or shared responsibility. There is also a growing awareness of trade offs that were not fully considered before, because every choice involves giving up something in order to gain something else. And when those trade offs are not clearly understood at the time decisions are made, they can lead to outcomes that feel unexpected or unsatisfactory later on. And recognizing those trade offs after the fact can be challenging because it involves acknowledging that certain benefits came at a cost that may not have been fully appreciated, and that realization can influence future decisions in a way that prioritizes minimizing risk over pursuing potential gains. What complicates this further is that different people are experiencing these trade offs at different points in time, which creates a lack of synchronization in how they perceive the situation. Because someone who is just beginning to question their assumptions is in a very different position from someone who has already adjusted their approach based on those questions. And that difference in timing can make it difficult to have productive conversations because each person is operating from a different stage of understanding. There is also the element of momentum because once a certain direction of behavior becomes established, it tends to continue unless there is a strong force that redirects it. And in this case, the momentum is moving toward reduced engagement, toward more cautious decision making, toward prioritizing stability over expansion. And reversing that momentum requires creating conditions that are compelling enough to justify a change in direction. And that is not something that can be achieved through surface level adjustments. It requires addressing the underlying factors that led to the current trajectory. At the same time, there is a shift in how people evaluate long term commitments. Because commitment inherently involves a degree of uncertainty, it requires trusting that future conditions will be favorable enough to justify the investment being made in the present. And when confidence in those future conditions is low, the willingness to commit decreases. And that decrease in commitment has a cascading effect because it influences not only individual decisions, but also the overall environment in which those decisions are made. There is also a growing recognition that stability is not something that can be assumed, it has to be built and maintained. And that requires consistent effort from all parties involved. And when that effort is not evenly distributed or when it is not aligned with shared goals, it creates imbalance. And imbalance leads to tension, and tension makes it difficult to sustain long term arrangements. And that difficulty reinforces the tendency to avoid entering into those arrangements in the first place. What is becoming more apparent is that many of the structures that were once relied upon to provide stability are no longer functioning in the same way. And that change has not been fully accounted for in how people approach their decisions. And as a result, there is a mismatch between expectation and reality that needs to be addressed in order to create more sustainable outcomes. There is also the influence of narrative fatigue, because when certain ideas are repeated over long periods of time without producing the expected results, people begin to lose confidence in those ideas. And that loss of confidence leads to a search for alternatives. And in the absence of clear alternatives, people often default to approaches that are simpler and more immediately effective, even if they are not optimal in the long term. At the same time, there is a shift in how accountability is perceived, because accountability requires acknowledging the role that individual choices play in shaping outcomes. And when that acknowledgement is absent or minimized, it becomes more difficult to make adjustments that lead to different results. And fostering a sense of accountability is essential for creating meaningful change. But it requires a willingness to engage with reality in a direct and honest way. There is also a need to consider the role of feedback, because feedback provides information about how decisions are playing out in practice. And when feedback is ignored or dismissed, it prevents the kind of adjustments that are necessary for improvement. And in this situation, there has been a tendency to filter feedback through existing beliefs rather than using it to reassess those beliefs. And that has contributed to the persistence of patterns that are not producing the desired outcomes. What is happening now is that feedback is becoming harder to ignore because it is more visible and more consistent. And as a result, there is an increasing pressure to respond to it in a meaningful way. And that response will play a significant role in determining how the situation evolves from this point forward. There is also the factor of resilience, because resilience determines how well individuals and systems adapt to change. And building resilience requires developing strategies that can handle variability and uncertainty. And in this context, resilience involves creating approaches that balance independence with connection, that manage risk without eliminating opportunity, and that allow for flexibility without sacrificing stability. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all strategies that worked in the past will be effective in the present because conditions have changed, and adapting to those changes requires updating the strategies that are being used. And that update process involves both letting go of outdated approaches and being open to new ones that are better aligned with current realities. There is also a need to consider the role of trust rebuilding, because trust is a foundational element of any cooperative system. And when it has been eroded, restoring it requires consistent actions that demonstrate reliability over time. And that process cannot be rushed. It requires patience and a commitment to maintaining alignment between words and actions. What makes this particularly challenging is that trust rebuilding often requires one side to take the initial steps without immediate reciprocation. And that can feel risky, but without those initial steps, the process cannot begin. And finding a way to initiate that process in a way that is both measured and sustainable is a key part of moving forward. There is also a broader question about what kind of structure is being built moving forward, because the current situation presents an opportunity to rethink how things are organized, to identify what elements are essential for stability and what elements may need to be adjusted or replaced. And that process requires a clear understanding of both the strengths and weaknesses of the previous structure. At the same time, there is a need to avoid overcorrecting, because in response to perceived failures, there can be a tendency to swing too far in the opposite direction, and that can create new imbalances that lead to different but equally challenging outcomes. And maintaining a balanced approach is important for creating a system that is both effective and sustainable. There is also the factor of communication clarity, because clear communication is essential for aligning expectations and reducing misunderstandings. And in this context, improving communication involves not only what is said, but how it is said, ensuring that messages are consistent, transparent, and aligned with actual behavior. What is becoming clear is that the path forward will require a combination of adjustments at both the individual and collective levels, because individual decisions shape collective outcomes, and collective outcomes influence individual decisions. And aligning those two levels is essential for creating a stable environment. There's also a need to recognize that change will not be uniform. Different individuals will adapt at different rates, and that variation needs to be accounted for in how solutions are developed and implemented, because a one size fits all approach is unlikely to be effective in a situation that involves such a wide range of experiences and perspectives. At the same time, there is an opportunity to learn from the current situation in a way that leads to more informed decision making in the future. And taking advantage of that opportunity requires a willingness to engage with the lessons that are emerging, even when they challenge existing beliefs. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a complex process of adjustment, one that involves reevaluating assumptions, realigning incentives, rebuilding trust, and developing strategies that are better suited to current conditions. And while this process is not easy, it is necessary for creating outcomes that are both realistic and sustainable. The silence that once signaled absence is now also a space where reflection is taking place, where decisions are being reconsidered, and where new approaches are being formed. And understanding what is happening within that silence is key to understanding what comes next, because it is within that space that the direction of future behavior is being shaped. And those decisions, made quietly and individually, will collectively determine the outcome of this shift. There is a quiet recalibration happening, in how people interpret reality. And it does not arrive with a headline or a turning point that everyone agrees on. It arrives in fragments, in small moments where something no longer feels convincing, where a statement that once sounded certain now feels incomplete, where a path that once seemed obvious now feels uncertain. And when enough of those fragments accumulate, they begin to form a new picture, one that is less influenced by what was expected and more grounded in what is actually being experienced. And that shift from expectation to observation is where the real change begins. Because once people start trusting their own observations more than the narratives they were given, their decisions begin to reflect that shift. And those decisions, repeated over time, reshape the environment around them. What makes this recalibration significant is that it does not require agreement to take hold. It spreads through individual recognition rather than collective consensus. And that means it can move in many directions at once, creating a landscape where different people are operating under different assumptions about the same reality. And that fragmentation makes it difficult to maintain a shared understanding because without a common framework, communication becomes less effective. Intentions are more easily misunderstood, and efforts to align can break down before they even begin. There is also a growing awareness of how much of past decision making was influenced by incomplete information, not necessarily incorrect, but incomplete in a way that emphasized certain outcomes while minimizing others. And when decisions are made based on partial information, the results can feel unpredictable, not because they are random, but because the full range of possible outcomes was never fully considered. And coming to terms with that requires a level of honesty that is not easy because it involves acknowledging that some choices were made without a complete understanding of their long term implications. At the same time, there is a shift in how people assess credibility because credibility is no longer tied solely to authority or repetition. It is increasingly tied to consistency between what is said and what is observed. And when that consistency is absent, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, it becomes much more difficult to influence behavior through messaging alone because people begin to rely more heavily on their own experiences and the experiences of those around them. There is also a pattern emerging in how people respond to uncertainty because uncertainty creates discomfort, and discomfort often leads to a search for control. And when control cannot be found in external systems, it is sought internally through adjustments in behavior that prioritize predictability and minimize exposure to variables that cannot be managed. And that shift toward internal control can lead to a reduction in external engagement, not because of disinterest, but because of a calculated effort to maintain stability in an environment that feels less predictable. What complicates this further is that the environment itself is influenced by these individual adjustments. Because as more people prioritize internal control and reduce external engagement, the systems that rely on participation become less stable, and that instability reinforces the perception that external systems are unreliable, which in turn encourages further withdrawal, creating a cycle that is difficult to break without a deliberate effort to restore confidence. There's also a shift in how people evaluate long term outcomes because when short term experiences consistently fail to align with expectations, confidence in long term projections decreases. And that decrease in confidence leads to more cautious planning, more emphasis on what can be achieved in the present rather than what might be possible in the future. And while that approach can provide immediate stability, it can also limit the potential for building something that requires sustained effort over time. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all uncertainty can be eliminated and that some level of risk is inherent in any meaningful endeavor. And balancing the need for stability with the willingness to accept necessary risk is one of the central challenges in navigating this situation because leaning too far in either direction can create its own set of problems, either by exposing oneself to unnecessary instability or by missing opportunities that require a degree of commitment. There is also the factor of shifting priorities because priorities are not fixed. They evolve based on experience. And as people encounter outcomes that differ from their expectations, they adjust what they value, what they pursue, and what they avoid. And those adjustments influence the overall direction of behavior in a way that is both personal and collective. Because while each decision is made individually, the patterns that emerge from those decisions shape the broader environment. What is becoming increasingly clear is that many of the previous assumptions about how things would unfold were based on a different set of conditions. And as those conditions have changed, the assumptions have not been updated at the same pace, creating a gap between expectation and reality that needs to be addressed in order to move forward effectively. There's also a growing emphasis on self sufficiency, not in the sense of complete isolation, but in the sense of reducing dependence on systems or arrangements that are perceived as unstable. And this emphasis influences how people structure their lives, how they allocate their resources, and how they approach decisions that involve shared responsibility, because the goal becomes maintaining as much control as possible over key aspects of life. And at the same time, there is a recognition that complete self sufficiency is not always practical or desirable, and that some level of cooperation is necessary for achieving certain outcomes. And finding the balance between independence and cooperation is a complex task that requires careful consideration of both the benefits and the risks associated with each approach. There's also the influence of past experiences on future expectations because experiences shape how people interpret new situations. And when those experiences are predominantly negative or inconsistent, they create a bias toward expecting similar outcomes in the future, and that bias can lead to decisions that prioritize avoiding negative outcomes over pursuing positive ones. And while that approach can reduce risk, it can also limit potential growth. What is happening now is that many of these biases are being reinforced through repeated experiences, creating a feedback loop where expectations influence decisions, decisions influence outcomes, and outcomes reinforce expectations. And breaking that loop requires introducing new experiences that challenge existing assumptions in a meaningful way, not through isolated incidents, but through consistent patterns that demonstrate a different set of possibilities. There is also a shift in how people interpret signals from their environment, because signals that were once taken at face value are now being scrutinized more closely. And that scrutiny is leading to a more cautious approach to decision making because people are less willing to rely on surface level indicators and more focused on underlying consistency and reliability. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all signals are equally reliable, and distinguishing between meaningful indicators and noise is an important part of navigating the current environment, because acting on unreliable signals can lead to decisions that do not produce the desired outcomes. There is also the factor of adaptation fatigue because constant adjustment to changing conditions can be exhausting. And when people reach a point where the effort required to adapt exceeds the perceived benefit, they may choose to disengage rather than continue to adjust. And that disengagement contributes to the overall reduction in participation that is being observed. What makes this particularly challenging is that adaptation fatigue can occur even when change is necessary, because the process of adapting itself requires resources, time, energy, attention. And when those resources are stretched, the capacity to adapt diminishes. And that creates a situation where necessary changes are delayed or avoided, further contributing to instability. There is also a need to consider the role of clarity in reducing fatigue, because clear expectations, consistent rules, and predictable outcomes make it easier to adapt without excessive effort. And improving clarity in the environment can help reduce the burden of constant adjustment, making it more feasible for people to remain engaged. At the same time, there is a recognition that clarity cannot be imposed unilaterally. it needs to be developed through alignment between different perspectives. And achieving that alignment requires open communication, a willingness to listen, and a commitment to finding common ground, even when it is not immediately obvious. There is also the factor of long term resilience, because resilience is built through the ability to handle variability without losing stability. And developing that ability requires a combination of flexibility and consistency. The flexibility to adapt to changing conditions, and the consistency to maintain core principles that provide a stable foundation. What is becoming apparent is that the current environment is testing resilience in a way that highlights both strengths and weaknesses. And learning from that test is essential for building a more stable framework moving forward, one that can handle change without becoming unstable. There is also a broader question about what kind of outcomes are realistically achievable under current conditions, and aligning expectations with those outcomes is crucial for avoiding disappointment and making decisions that are grounded in reality rather than idealized projections. And at the same time, there is an opportunity to redefine success in a way that is more aligned with current conditions, focusing on outcomes that are both meaningful and attainable. And that redefinition can help guide decisions in a direction that is more sustainable. There is also the importance of recognizing that change is an ongoing process, not a single event, and that maintaining alignment between behavior and reality requires continuous evaluation and adjustment rather than relying on a fixed set of assumptions. And what we are seeing now is a phase of that process where many of the previous assumptions are being challenged and new ones are being formed, and navigating this phase effectively requires a willingness to engage with uncertainty, to learn from experience, and to make adjustments that are informed by observation rather than expectation. There's also a need to maintain perspective, because while the current situation may feel unstable, it is part of a larger process of adjustment that can lead to more stable outcomes if approached thoughtfully. And maintaining that perspective can help guide decisions in a way that is constructive rather than reactive. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all aspects of the situation can be controlled, and that focusing on what can be controlled is a more effective strategy than attempting to manage every variable. And that focus can help reduce the sense of overwhelm that often accompanies complex situations. There is also the importance of incremental progress, because large changes are often the result of many small adjustments made consistently over time. And focusing on manageable steps can make the process of adaptation more sustainable and less overwhelming. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a process of realignment that involves adjusting expectations, behaviors, and strategies to better match current conditions. And while this process is not without its challenges, it also presents an opportunity to build a more stable and balanced framework for the future, one that is informed by experience, grounded in reality, and capable of adapting to change without losing stability. The silence that has been present throughout this shift is not just an absence of noise, it is a space where these adjustments are being made, where people are reassessing their priorities, their expectations, and their strategies. And understanding what is happening within that space is essential for understanding the direction of future behavior, because it is within that quiet recalibration that the next phase of this process is being shaped, one decision at a time, one adjustment at a time, gradually forming a new pattern that will define what comes next. There is a stage that comes after realization, and it is not often discussed because it is quieter than everything that comes before it. And that stage is acceptance, not the kind that celebrates or resists, but the kind that simply recognizes what is and begins to operate within it. And acceptance changes behavior in ways that are subtle but powerful. Because once someone accepts that a situation is real, they stop trying to force it into something it is not, and instead begin to make decisions that align with the conditions in front of them. And those decisions tend to be more stable, more measured, and more consistent over time. And when enough people reach that stage, the overall environment shifts from one of tension and resistance to one of adjustment and reconfiguration. What makes acceptance so significant in this context is that it often arrives after a period of frustration, after attempts to reconcile expectation with reality have failed, after efforts to maintain a previous framework no longer produce results. And when those attempts are exhausted, acceptance becomes less of a choice and more of a natural progression. Because continuing to resist what is clearly unfolding requires more energy than most people are willing to sustain indefinitely. And once that resistance fades, clarity tends to follow, not because the situation has improved, but because it is being seen more directly. At the same time, acceptance does not mean passivity. It does not mean giving up or disengaging completely. It means shifting focus from what cannot be controlled to what can be influenced. And that shift in focus is where new strategies begin to form. Strategies that are grounded in current conditions rather than outdated assumptions. And those strategies often prioritize stability, sustainability, and efficiency, because those are the factors that provide the most reliable outcomes in an environment that is still adjusting. There's also a change in how people evaluate effort during this stage, because effort that is aligned with reality tends to produce more consistent results, while effort that is misaligned tends to create frustration. And recognizing that distinction allows for a more effective allocation of time and energy, focusing on actions that have a clear and realistic path to success rather than those that rely on conditions that are no longer present. What begins to emerge from this process is a new kind of equilibrium, not the same as what existed before, but something that reflects the current balance of incentives, expectations, and behavior. And while this equilibrium may not satisfy all previous expectations, it provides a level of predictability that allows for planning and decision making to take place with greater confidence. And that predictability is valuable because it reduces uncertainty, which in turn reduces the need for constant adjustment. At the same time, there is a recognition that equilibrium is not static. It can shift as conditions change, and maintaining it requires ongoing attention and adaptation. But the difference is that once a stable baseline is established, adjustments can be made from a position of clarity rather than confusion. And that makes the process more manageable. There is also a shift in how people interpret outcomes, because during the earlier stages, outcomes may have been viewed through the lens of expectation, leading to disappointment when they did not align. But during acceptance, outcomes are evaluated based on how well they align with reality. And that shift in evaluation criteria reduces unnecessary frustration because it focuses on what is achievable rather than what was assumed. What is particularly important during this stage is the role of consistency, because consistent behavior over time reinforces stability, and stability creates a foundation that can support more complex decisions. And without that foundation, it is difficult to build anything that requires sustained effort because the underlying conditions are too variable. At the same time, there is a need to remain flexible because while consistency is important, rigidity can prevent necessary adjustments when conditions change. And balancing consistency with flexibility is key to maintaining stability without becoming unresponsive to new information. There is also a change in how people approach risk, because during earlier stages, risk may have been either underestimated or overemphasized. But during acceptance, risk is assessed more pragmatically, based on observed patterns and realistic outcomes. And that pragmatic approach leads to decisions that are more aligned with actual conditions rather than perceived ones. What becomes clear is that many of the previous conflicts were driven by a mismatch between expectation and reality, and as that mismatch is reduced, the intensity of those conflicts tends to decrease, not because the underlying issues have been resolved completely, but because they are being approached with a more accurate understanding of the conditions involved. At the same time, there is an opportunity to rebuild certain aspects of interaction on a more stable foundation. But that rebuilding process requires a willingness to operate within the new equilibrium rather than attempting to recreate the previous one. And that distinction is important because it determines whether efforts are forward looking or focused on restoring something that no longer exists. There's also a shift in how communication is approached because during earlier stages, communication may have been influenced by competing narratives and assumptions, but during acceptance, communication becomes more direct, more focused on practical outcomes, and less influenced by idealized expectations. And that clarity can improve the effectiveness of interactions because it reduces misunderstandings. What is also emerging is a more selective approach to engagement because, with a clearer understanding of what works and what does not, people become more intentional about where they invest their time and energy. And that selectivity can lead to fewer but more stable interactions because they are based on aligned expectations rather than assumptions. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all desired outcomes will be achievable, and accepting that limitation is part of operating within reality. And while it may feel restrictive, it also provides clarity because it allows for focusing on outcomes that are within reach rather than pursuing those that are unlikely under current conditions. There's also the factor of long term perspective, because acceptance allows for a more realistic assessment of how decisions made today will influence future outcomes. And that perspective can guide choices in a way that prioritizes sustainability over short term gains. And that shift is important for building stability over time. What becomes evident is that the process of adjustment is not about returning to a previous state. It is about moving toward a new configuration that reflects current realities. And that process involves letting go of certain expectations while reinforcing others that are aligned with observed outcomes. And at the same time, there is a need to maintain awareness of ongoing changes. Because even as a new equilibrium is established, conditions may continue to evolve, and staying attuned to those changes is essential for maintaining alignment between behavior and reality. There's also an opportunity to refine decision making processes, using the insights gained from previous experiences to make more informed choices. And that refinement can improve the quality of outcomes over time by reducing the likelihood of repeating patterns that did not produce desired results. What is also important is the role of patience, because meaningful adjustments take time, and expecting immediate results can lead to unnecessary frustration. And maintaining a long term perspective helps to manage expectations and allows for gradual progress to accumulate into more significant outcomes. At the same time, there is a recognition that while some aspects of the situation are beyond individual control, there are still areas where influence can be applied. And focusing on those areas is a more effective use of effort than attempting to manage factors that cannot be changed directly. There is also a shift in how success is measured, moving away from broad or abstract definitions toward more specific and attainable criteria. And that shift can improve satisfaction because it aligns expectations with what is realistically achievable. What becomes clear is that acceptance is not an endpoint. It is a stage that allows for more effective navigation of the current environment. And from that stage, further adjustments can be made as needed, guided by observation and experience rather than assumption. At the same time, there is a need to remain open to new information because even as patterns become more established, new developments can influence outcomes, and maintaining that openness ensures that decisions remain aligned with the most current understanding of the situation. There is also the importance of maintaining balance because focusing too heavily on one aspect of the situation can lead to neglect of others. And a balanced approach that considers multiple factors is more likely to produce stable outcomes. What is unfolding now is a gradual transition from a period of uncertainty and adjustment to a period of stabilization, where behavior expectations and outcomes begin to align more closely. And while this stabilization may not match previous expectations, it provides a framework within which more predictable and sustainable decisions can be made. At the same time, there is a recognition that this framework is not fixed. It can continue to evolve as new information becomes available and as conditions change. And maintaining adaptability within that framework is key to navigating future developments effectively. There's also an understanding that the lessons learned during this process can inform future decisions, not just in this context, but in other areas as well, because the principles of aligning expectations with reality, assessing risk pragmatically, and adapting to changing conditions are broadly applicable. What becomes evident is that the path forward is not about restoring what was lost, but about building something that is better aligned with current realities. And that process requires a combination of acceptance, adaptation, and intentional decision making. And the silence that once represented absence and then reflection now represents a kind of clarity, a space where decisions are being made with a more accurate understanding of the environment. And within that space, a new pattern is taking shape, one that is defined not by what was expected, but by what is actually possible. And that distinction is what will ultimately determine the stability and sustainability of what comes next. There is a turning that happens once clarity settles in, and it is not loud or dramatic. It does not look like a sudden reversal or a sweeping change. It looks like a series of small, deliberate choices that begin to point in a consistent direction. And that direction is shaped by what people have learned rather than what they were told. And when enough of those choices align, they begin to form a new pattern that replaces the old one, not by force, but by repetition. And repetition is what gives any pattern its strength, because what is done consistently becomes what is expected, and what is expected becomes what is normal. What defines the stage is not reaction, but intention, because the earlier phases were filled with responses to shifting conditions, adjustments made in real time, attempts to reconcile conflicting signals. But now, the decisions being made are more measured, more informed by experience, and more focused on creating outcomes that are stable over time. And that shift from reactive to intentional behavior changes the entire dynamic because it introduces a level of predictability that was missing before. And predictability allows for planning, for coordination, for building something that extends beyond the immediate moment. There's also a recalibration in how value is assigned because value is no longer based on abstract ideals or external validation. It is based on tangible outcomes, on what consistently produces stability, clarity, and a sense of control. And that recalibration influences every decision, from how time is spent to how resources are allocated. And when value is grounded in tangible outcomes, it becomes easier to identify what is worth pursuing and what is not, because the criteria for evaluation are clearer and more consistent. And at the same time, there is a narrowing of focus, not in a restrictive sense, but in a selective one, because with a clearer understanding of what works, there is less incentive to engage in activities that do not align with that understanding. And that selectivity leads to a more efficient use of effort because energy is directed toward areas that have a higher likelihood of producing desired outcomes and away from those that have consistently fallen short. There's also a shift in how uncertainty is managed because rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely, which is not possible, the approach becomes one of containing it, limiting exposure to variables that cannot be controlled, and building structures that can absorb fluctuations without becoming unstable. And this approach does not remove uncertainty, but it reduces its impact, making it more manageable. What becomes more evident is that stability is not something that emerges on its own. It is constructed through consistent choices that reinforce one another. And those choices often involve trade offs, decisions to prioritize certain outcomes over others. And while those trade offs may limit some possibilities, they strengthen the foundation on which other possibilities can be built. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all trade offs are equal, and that some sacrifices produce greater long term benefits than others. And understanding which trade offs are worthwhile requires a clear sense of priorities, and that clarity is what allows for more effective decision making. There is also a change in how feedback is integrated because feedback is no longer filtered through preconceived expectations. It is used as a direct input for adjustment, and that makes the process of adaptation more efficient because it reduces the delay between observation and response, allowing for quicker alignment with current conditions. What begins to take shape is a framework that is both flexible and grounded. Flexible enough to adapt to changes, but grounded enough to maintain stability. And that balance is what allows for sustained progress because it prevents both rigidity and instability, which are the two extremes that often disrupt long term outcomes. At the same time, there is a growing emphasis on consistency because consistency builds trust, both internally and externally. And trust is what allows for more complex interactions to take place without excessive hesitation. And when consistency is present, it reduces the need for constant reassessment, freeing up resources to focus on building rather than stabilizing. There is also a refinement in how decisions are made because with more information and experience, the criteria for decision making become more precise, more aligned with actual outcomes, and less influenced by assumptions that have not been supported by experience. And this refinement leads to decisions that are more likely to produce consistent results. What is also emerging is a clearer distinction between what is within control and what is not. And that distinction is important because it allows for effort to be directed more effectively, focusing on areas where influence can be applied rather than dissipating energy on factors that cannot be changed. At the same time, there is a recognition that influence is not static. It can change over time as conditions evolve, and maintaining awareness of those changes is essential for ensuring that decisions remain aligned with current realities. There's also a shift in how time is perceived because rather than being viewed as something that provides endless opportunity, it is recognized as a finite resource that needs to be allocated carefully. And that recognition leads to more deliberate choices about how time is spent, prioritizing activities that contribute to long term stability over those that provide only short term satisfaction. What becomes clear is that the process of building stability is cumulative. It is the result of many small, consistent actions rather than a few large ones. And that understanding shifts the focus from seeking immediate results to maintaining consistent effort over time. At the same time, there is a need to maintain adaptability because even as stability is built, conditions can change, and being able to adjust without losing the foundation that has been established is key to sustaining progress. There's also a growing awareness of the importance of alignment because when different aspects of life are aligned with the same set of priorities, it creates a reinforcing effect that strengthens overall stability. And achieving that alignment requires a clear understanding of what those priorities are. What is becoming evident is that clarity is one of the most valuable resources in this process because it reduces uncertainty, improves decision making, and allows for more effective use of effort. And maintaining clarity requires ongoing evaluation and a willingness to adjust as new information becomes available. At the same time, there is a recognition that clarity does not eliminate complexity, but it makes complexity more manageable because it provides a framework for understanding how different elements interact and how changes in one area can affect others. And there is also an emphasis on sustainability because decisions are increasingly evaluated based on their ability to produce consistent results over time rather than short term gains. And that emphasis leads to choices that may be more conservative in the present, but more stable in the long term. What begins to emerge from this focus on sustainability is a different kind of progress, one that is less visible in the short term, but more resilient over time. And that resilience is what allows for continued advancement, even when conditions are not ideal. At the same time, there is a recognition that progress is not always linear and that setbacks can occur, but with a stable foundation, those setbacks are less disruptive and can be managed more effectively. There is also a refinement in how expectations are set, because expectations that are aligned with reality are more likely to be met. And meeting expectations reinforces confidence, which in turn supports further progress. What becomes clear is that confidence is built through consistency, through repeated experiences that confirm that the chosen approach is effective, and that confidence allows for more decisive action because it reduces hesitation. At the same time, there is a need to remain grounded because overconfidence can lead to overlooking potential risks, and maintaining a balance between confidence and caution is important for sustaining progress. There is also a recognition that not all outcomes are immediate and that some require time to develop. And understanding this helps to manage expectations and maintain patience during the process. What is also emerging is a more disciplined approach to decision making, one that is less influenced by external pressures and more guided by internal criteria that have been developed through experience. And that discipline contributes to consistency, which in turn supports stability. At the same time, there is an understanding that discipline requires effort, and maintaining it over time involves creating systems and routines that support consistent behavior, reducing the reliance on motivation alone. There is also an awareness of the importance of boundaries because boundaries help to protect stability by limiting exposure to factors that could introduce unnecessary variability. And establishing clear boundaries is part of maintaining control over the environment. What becomes evident is that control in this context is not about eliminating all uncertainty, but about managing it effectively. And that management involves a combination of preparation, adaptability, and consistent decision making. At the same time, there is a recognition that preparation is an ongoing process because conditions can change, and staying prepared requires continuous attention and adjustment. There is also a shift in how success is internalized because rather than relying on external validation, success is measured by how well outcomes align with personal criteria that are grounded in reality. And that internalization provides a more stable sense of progress because it is less influenced by external fluctuations. What is unfolding is a transition from a state of reaction to a state of construction where decisions are not just responses to conditions, but are part of a deliberate effort to build something that can endure. And that shift is what defines the stage, because it represents a move toward creating stability rather than simply managing instability. The silence that has accompanied this entire process is now filled with intention, with deliberate choices that are shaping a new pattern, one that is defined by consistency, clarity, and alignment with reality. And within that pattern, the direction forward becomes more defined, not because all uncertainty has been removed, but because the approach to managing it has become more effective. And that effectiveness is what allows for continued progress, even in an environment that is still evolving. There is a moment where the dust finally settles enough for patterns to be seen without distortion, and in that moment, something subtle but powerful happens because what once felt chaotic begins to reveal structure. Not a perfect structure, not something designed or intentional, but a natural arrangement that emerges when enough individual decisions align over time, and that structure does not ask for agreement. It simply exists, shaping outcomes in ways that are consistent whether people acknowledge it or not, and recognizing that structure changes how people move within it because once patterns are visible, they can be anticipated, and anticipation is what allows for strategic behavior rather than reactive behavior. What defines the stage is not discovery, but recognition, because the information was always present in some form. It just was not interpreted in a way that connected the pieces. And once those connections are made, the same information begins to tell a different story, one that is more coherent, more grounded, and more aligned with observed reality. And that shift in interpretation influences every subsequent decision because decisions are based not just on what is known, but on how what is known is understood. There is also a shift in how people approach effort because effort is no longer applied broadly in the hope that something will produce a result. It is applied more precisely, directed toward areas where patterns indicate a higher likelihood of success, and that precision increases efficiency because it reduces wasted energy and focuses resources where they can have the greatest impact. At the same time, there is a recognition that precision requires discipline because it involves saying no to opportunities that do not align with the identified patterns. Even when those opportunities may appear attractive on the surface, and maintaining that discipline is what allows for consistent outcomes because it prevents deviation from the approach that has been shown to work. There is also a refinement in how risk is calculated because risk is no longer viewed as a single factor. It is understood as a combination of variables that interact with one another. And assessing risk involves evaluating those variables in context rather than in isolation. And this more nuanced approach leads to decisions that are better aligned with actual conditions rather than perceived ones. What becomes more evident is that stability is not about eliminating variability, it is about managing it in a way that prevents it from disrupting the overall structure. And that management involves creating buffers, building in flexibility, and maintaining awareness of how different elements interact so that adjustments can be made before instability develops. At the same time, there is a shift in how people define progress because progress is no longer measured solely by expansion or growth. It is also measured by consistency, by the ability to maintain desired outcomes over time without excessive effort or disruption. And that redefinition changes priorities because it places greater emphasis on sustainability rather than rapid advancement. There's also an increased focus on alignment between intention and action because misalignment between the two creates inefficiency, and aligning them requires clarity about goals and a realistic understanding of what actions will lead to those goals. And that clarity reduces unnecessary effort and improves the likelihood of achieving desired outcomes. What is also emerging is a stronger sense of boundaries, not as a limitation, but as a means of protecting the structure that has been built. Because without boundaries, external variables can introduce instability, and maintaining clear boundaries allows for greater control over the environment and reduces exposure to unnecessary risk. At the same time, there is a recognition that boundaries need to be adaptable because conditions can change. And rigid boundaries can become restrictive if they are not adjusted to reflect new realities. And balancing firmness with flexibility is key to maintaining both stability and responsiveness. There's also a refinement in how people interpret signals from their environment because signals are no longer taken at face value. They are evaluated based on consistency, context, and alignment with known patterns. And this evaluation process reduces the likelihood of being influenced by misleading or incomplete information. What becomes clear is that clarity is cumulative. It builds over time as patterns are observed, tested, and confirmed. And maintaining that clarity requires ongoing attention because new information can either reinforce or challenge existing understanding. And integrating that information effectively is part of sustaining a clear perspective. At the same time, there is a shift in how time is managed because time is recognized as a critical resource that needs to be allocated strategically. And that allocation is guided by priorities that are aligned with long term stability rather than short term gains. And this approach leads to more consistent outcomes because it reduces the influence of impulsive decisions. There's also an emphasis on consistency of behavior because consistent behavior reinforces patterns, and reinforced patterns create predictability. And predictability is what allows for more complex planning and coordination because it reduces uncertainty about how actions will lead to outcomes. What is also becoming evident is that not all variability is negative. Some variability provides opportunities for adjustment and improvement. And the key is distinguishing between variability that introduces instability and variability that can be leveraged for growth. And that distinction allows for more effective management of changing conditions. At the same time, there is a recognition that growth needs to be integrated into the existing structure rather than disrupting it. And that integration requires careful planning and a clear understanding of how new elements will interact with established ones. There's also a refinement in how people approach decision making under uncertainty, because uncertainty is no longer seen as a barrier to action. It is factored into the decision making process, and decisions are made with an understanding of potential variability rather than in spite of it. And this approach leads to more resilient outcomes because it accounts for a range of possibilities. What becomes more apparent is that resilience is built through preparation, through anticipating potential challenges and creating strategies to address them. And that preparation reduces the impact of unexpected changes because it provides a framework for response. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all challenges can be anticipated, and maintaining flexibility is essential for responding to unforeseen developments. And this combination of preparation and adaptability is what supports long term stability. There's also an increased awareness of the importance of feedback loops because feedback provides information about how decisions are performing in practice, and effective feedback loops allow for continuous adjustment, ensuring that behavior remains aligned with desired outcomes. What is also emerging is a more deliberate approach to communication because clear and consistent communication reduces misunderstandings and improves coordination, and effective communication is aligned with observed reality rather than idealized expectations, making it more reliable. At the same time, there is a recognition that communication needs to be reciprocal because alignment requires input from multiple perspectives, and creating space for that input is part of building a stable structure that reflects a range of experiences. There's also a shift in how people evaluate long term commitments because commitments are assessed based on their alignment with established patterns and their ability to contribute to stability. And this assessment leads to more selective engagement, focusing on commitments that have a clear and realistic path to success. What becomes clear is that selectivity is not about limitation, it is about optimization, directing effort toward areas that produce consistent results and away from those that do not. And this optimization improves overall efficiency and stability. At the same time, there is a recognition that optimization requires ongoing evaluation because conditions can change, and maintaining alignment between effort and outcome requires continuous adjustment. There is also an emphasis on building systems that support consistent behavior because relying solely on individual effort can lead to variability. And systems provide a framework that reinforces desired actions and reduces the likelihood of deviation. What is also becoming evident is that systems need to be designed with both stability and flexibility in mind, because overly rigid systems can become ineffective when conditions change, while overly flexible systems can lack the consistency needed for stability. At the same time, there is a recognition that balance is essential, and achieving balance requires a clear understanding of how different elements interact and how adjustments in one area can affect others. There is also a refinement in how success is internalized, because success is no longer dependent on external validation. It is measured by how well outcomes align with personal criteria that are grounded in reality, and this internalization provides a more stable sense of progress. What becomes apparent is that internal consistency is as important as external outcomes, because when actions are aligned with internal criteria, it reduces conflict and increases clarity. And that alignment supports sustained effort over time. At the same time, there is a recognition that maintaining internal consistency requires ongoing reflection, because as conditions change, internal criteria may need to be adjusted to remain aligned with reality. There's also an increased focus on long term sustainability because decisions are evaluated based on their ability to maintain stability over time rather than producing immediate results. And this focus leads to more deliberate and measured actions. What is unfolding is a transition from a phase of adjustment to a phase of consolidation, where the patterns that have emerged are being reinforced and integrated into a stable framework. And this consolidation provides a foundation for future development. And at the same time, there is a recognition that consolidation is not the end of the process. It is a stage that allows for further refinement and growth, and maintaining adaptability within this stage is essential for responding to new challenges. There is also an awareness that the process of building stability is ongoing and that maintaining it requires consistent effort and attention, because without that effort, variability can reintroduce instability. What becomes clear is that the direction forward is defined by the patterns that have been established, and those patterns are the result of many individual decisions that have aligned over time. And maintaining alignment between those decisions and the evolving environment is key to sustaining progress. The silence that once represented uncertainty and then reflection now represents structure, a framework that has been built through consistent choices and reinforced through experience. And within that framework, the path forward is not dictated by external expectations, but by the patterns that have proven to be effective. And those patterns, maintained and refined over time, are what will determine the stability and sustainability of what comes next. There is a final phase that rarely gets named because it does not feel like an ending. It feels like something quieter, something more settled. And that phase is integration, where everything that has been learned is no longer something that needs to be consciously applied. It becomes automatic. It becomes the default way of thinking and acting. And once that happens, the need for constant analysis fades because the patterns have been internalized, the adjustments have been made, and behavior begins to flow in a way that is consistent without requiring effort to maintain it. And that is what makes this stage different from all the others, because it is not about reacting, not about correcting, not about figuring things out. It is about operating within a framework that has already been shaped by experience. What defines integration is not perfection, but coherence, because everything begins to align in a way that reduces friction. Decisions feel more straightforward, actions produce more predictable outcomes, and the gap between intention and result becomes smaller. Not because uncertainty has been eliminated, but because the approach to managing it has become more refined, and that refinement allows for a level of stability that was not present before. A stability that is not dependent on external conditions remaining constant, but on the ability to adapt without losing alignment. There's also a shift in how effort is experienced, because effort no longer feels like something that is constantly being expended to maintain control. It becomes more efficient, more targeted, and in many cases, less noticeable because the systems and habits that have been developed are doing much of the work. And this reduction in perceived effort is not a sign of disengagement. It is a sign that the approach has become more effective, that energy is no longer being wasted on action that do not contribute to desired outcomes. At the same time, there is a recognition that integration does not mean stagnation. It does not mean that nothing changes. It means that change is managed within a stable framework. And that framework provides a reference point for evaluating new information, allowing for adjustments to be made without disrupting the overall structure. And that ability to incorporate change without losing stability is what allows for sustained progress over time. There's also a deeper understanding of trade offs, not just in theory, but in practice, because through experience, it becomes clear which trade offs produce value and which do not. And that understanding allows for more confident decision making because the consequences of different choices are no longer abstract. They are based on observed outcomes, and that clarity reduces hesitation, making it easier to commit to a course of action. What becomes more evident is that consistency is one of the most powerful forces in shaping outcomes because consistent actions reinforce patterns, and reinforced patterns create predictability. And predictability is what allows for long term planning and stability. And maintaining consistency requires discipline. But once that discipline is established, it becomes part of the structure rather than something that needs to be constantly imposed. At the same time, there is a balance between consistency and flexibility because while consistency provides stability, flexibility allows for adaptation. And maintaining that balance is what prevents rigidity, ensuring that the system can evolve as conditions change without becoming unstable. There is also a shift in how success is perceived because success is no longer tied to external validation or comparison. It is measured by alignment, by how well outcomes match the criteria that have been developed through experience. And that shift creates a more stable sense of progress because it is not dependent on factors that are outside of control. What is also emerging is a stronger sense of autonomy, not in isolation, but in the ability to make decisions that are aligned with personal criteria without being overly influenced by external pressures. And that autonomy supports consistency because it reduces the variability introduced by conflicting expectations. At the same time, there is a recognition that autonomy does not eliminate the need for cooperation, and that effective cooperation requires alignment of expectations and clear communication. And with a stable framework in place, that alignment becomes easier to achieve because the criteria for engagement are more clearly defined. There is also a refinement in how people approach long term planning because planning is now based on patterns that have been observed rather than assumptions that have not been tested. And this leads to plans that are more realistic and more likely to produce the desired outcomes. What becomes clear is that stability is not a fixed state, it is a process that requires ongoing attention, and maintaining stability involves continuously monitoring conditions, integrating new information, and making adjustments as needed. And this ongoing process is what allows for sustained alignment with reality. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all adjustments need to be large. In fact, many of the most effective adjustments are small, incremental changes that refine the existing structure without disrupting it. And focusing on these smaller adjustments makes the process more manageable and less disruptive. There is also an increased awareness of the importance of boundaries because boundaries protect the structure that has been built. And maintaining clear boundaries ensures that external factors do not introduce instability. And these boundaries are not arbitrary, they are based on patterns that have been observed and validated through experience. What is also becoming evident is that clarity reduces complexity not by simplifying reality, but by providing a framework for understanding it. And with that framework, complex situations can be navigated more effectively because the relationships between different elements are better understood. At the same time, there is a recognition that complexity cannot be eliminated, and attempting to do so can lead to oversimplification, which creates its own problems. And maintaining a balance between clarity and complexity is key to making informed decisions. There is also a refinement in how feedback is used because feedback is now integrated continuously, informing adjustments in real time rather than being evaluated only after outcomes have occurred. And this continuous integration allows for more precise alignment with desired outcomes. What becomes apparent is that the process of integration creates a level of resilience that was not present before, because resilience is built through the ability to maintain alignment despite variability. And with a stable framework, variability becomes less disruptive because it can be absorbed and managed within the system. And at the same time, there's a recognition that resilience does not mean invulnerability. Challenges will still occur, but with a well integrated approach, those challenges can be addressed more effectively, reducing their impact on overall stability. There's also a shift in how people interpret change, because change is no longer seen as something that disrupts stability. It is seen as something that can be incorporated into the existing framework. And this perspective reduces resistance to change, making adaptation more fluid. What is unfolding is a state where behavior, expectations, and outcomes are aligned in a way that requires less effort to maintain. And this alignment creates a sense of coherence that supports long term stability because it reduces internal conflict and external variability. At the same time, there is a recognition that maintaining this state requires awareness, because without awareness, patterns can shift without being noticed, and that can lead to misalignment over time. And maintaining awareness ensures that adjustments can be made before instability develops. There is also an emphasis on sustainability, because decisions are evaluated based on their long term impact rather than short term gains. And this focus ensures that the structure that has been built remains stable over time. What becomes clear is that sustainability is achieved through consistent alignment with reality, and that alignment requires ongoing attention. Because reality is not static, it evolves, and maintaining alignment with it is an active process. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all aspects of the environment can be controlled. And focusing on what can be influenced is a more effective strategy than attempting to manage every variable. And this focus allows for more efficient use of effort. There is also refinement in how people approach uncertainty, because uncertainty is now factored into the structure rather than being treated as an exception. And this integration reduces the disruptive impact of uncertainty, making it easier to navigate. What is also emerging is a sense of confidence that is grounded in experience rather than assumption. And this confidence supports decisive action because it is based on patterns that have been consistently observed. At the same time, there is a recognition that confidence needs to be balanced with awareness, because overconfidence can lead to overlooking potential risks, and maintaining that balance is key to sustaining stability. There is also an understanding that progress is not always visible, because much of the work that supports stability happens beneath the surface in the form of consistent actions and adjustments that do not produce immediate results but contribute to long term outcomes. What becomes evident is that integration creates a foundation that allows for both stability and growth, because with a stable base, new elements can be added without disrupting the overall structure. And this ability to grow without instability is what defines sustainable progress. At the same time, there is a recognition that growth needs to be aligned with the existing framework, and that alignment ensures that new developments contribute to stability rather than undermining it. There's also an increased focus on maintaining balance, because balance ensures that no single element becomes dominant to the point of creating instability. And maintaining balance requires ongoing evaluation and adjustment. And what is unfolding now is a steady state, not static, but stable enough to support consistent behavior and predictable outcomes. And within this state, decisions are made with clarity, actions are taken with intention, and outcomes are aligned with expectations. At the same time, there is a recognition that this state is the result of a process, one that involved adjustment, reevaluation, and refinement, and maintaining it requires continuing that process even as conditions evolve. There is also an understanding that the lessons learned through this process are not limited to this context. They can be applied more broadly, informing decision making in other areas where alignment between expectation and reality is essential. What becomes clear is that the journey from uncertainty to integration is not about achieving a perfect state. It is about developing a framework that can handle variability while maintaining alignment. And that framework is what allows for sustained stability. The silence that has been present throughout this entire progression has transformed from absence to reflection to clarity to structure, and now to integration. And within that silence, there is no longer confusion or resistance. There is only a steady, consistent pattern of behavior that reflects what has been learned. And that pattern is what defines the path forward, not as a return to what was, but as a continuation of what has been built, grounded in reality, shaped by experience, and sustained through consistency. And that is where everything settles, not in noise, not in conflict, but in a quiet understanding that does not need to be announced because it is already being lived. If you made it this far, you already understand something most people are still trying to avoid. And that is the fact that reality does not bend to comfort, it does not pause for second chances, and it does not negotiate with expectations that were built on shaky ground. And the ones who are going to move forward are not the ones waiting for things to go back to how they were. They are the ones who accepted what changed, adjusted to it, and built something that actually works in the world as it is right now, not the world as it was sold to them. Shout out to the 2 Hour Gang for staying all the way through and actually hearing this out, because most people tap out. The second things get uncomfortable. And if you are enjoying these angry guy videos, you can show support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep this going and keeps these conversations alive without filtering them down into something safe and meaningless. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think about everything that was laid out here? Do you agree with it? Do you see it playing out the same way? Or do you think people are still missing something bigger that has not been said yet? Drop your thoughts and actually say what you think, not what you think you are supposed to say. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video, and just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.